In the middle of the city, a black woman was stopped by the police for no good reason. They mocked her, insulted her, and then handcuffed her like a criminal. But what they didn't know was, she was no ordinary woman, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. What happened? Who is she? Let's find out. Tonight, the city sky was a deep black, illuminated only by the flashing neon lights from the tall buildings. The air carried the slight chill of early spring, mixed with the quiet of a late night when the streets were gradually empty of vehicles. Aaliyah Carter stepped out of the revolving doors of an upscale restaurant, her Louboutin heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Her long, curly hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and her sharp eyes held a calm yet wary quality that had long been her habit. At 38, Aaliyah is one of the most respected federal prosecutors, not only for her sharp intellect, but also for her uncompromising spirit and uncompromising attitude toward injustice. Raised in a middle-class family with a long history of fighting for black rights, she learned early on the harshness of the system. Her parents were civil rights activists in the 1970s, fighting tirelessly to give their daughter a better future. And now Aaliyah continues that legacy, not through street protests, but through the law. It had been a long day, but a pleasant one. She'd spent a rare evening relaxing with friends, former law school colleagues, at a fancy restaurant, laughing, toasting, and briefly putting the pressures of work behind her. But Aaliyah never let her guard down. She was always conscious of her place in society, a successful black woman working in a justice system rife with prejudice. She walked to the parking lot and opened the door of her shiny black Mercedes-Benz, a reward for herself after years of hard work. The car glided smoothly over the road, passing through the streets that were gradually falling silent. The city at night had its own beauty, both peaceful and hidden with invisible dangers. A soft jazz tune played on the radio, blending with the smooth motion of the car. Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her hands on the steering wheel, enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. But a few minutes later, that peace was interrupted by a familiar sound, a police siren. She frowned slightly, glancing at the rearview mirror. Two red and blue lights were flashing in the darkness, approaching at a rapid speed. A patrol car was following closely behind, flashing its lights to signal her to pull over. Aaliyah checked the dashboard. There was no sign of her speeding. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. Her car, a new Mercedes-Benz, was in perfect condition. She couldn't think of any legitimate reason to be stopped, but she wasn't surprised. It wasn't unusual for a black man driving a luxury car to be stopped by the police for no reason. Aaliyah knew this, but she kept her cool. She turned on her signal, slowed down, and pulled over. Her eyes scanned the rearview mirror as she saw two police officers getting out of the car. Officer Jake Reynolds approached her window with a cocky gait. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with short blonde hair and a sharp face, with cold, piercing eyes. His demeanor was not only professional, but commanding, the kind of power that comes from those who abuse it. Behind him, Officer Scott Miller stood slightly back, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his gun. He was a little younger, in his early 30s, but he looked no less arrogant. They both had a familiar demeanor, one Aaliyah had seen many times in her career. Reynolds knocked loudly on the car window, making no attempt to hide the arrogance in his actions. "Roll down your window immediately." His voice was dry, devoid of any politeness. Aaliyah looked straight at him through the glass, taking a deep breath before pressing the button to lower the window. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. Reynolds crossed his arms over his chest, glancing down at her luxury car before looking up at her face. "Do you know why we stopped your car?" Aaliyah tilted her head, eyebrows raised slightly. "No, I don't know. Did I do something wrong?" Reynolds smirked. "Your taillight is broken." Aaliyah glanced back, where the taillight still reflected the light from the police car. She knew it was a lie. "Really?" she replied, her voice devoid of surprise. "Because I'm pretty sure my car was inspected just a few days ago." Reynolds leaned against the car door, his sharp eyes scrutinizing her every move. "Show me your papers." Aaliyah didn't rush, but she didn't slow down either. She opened her purse, took out her driver's license and registration, and handed it to him. Reynolds took it without looking at it, instead studying her closely, as if searching for some opening. Miller was still standing behind the car, but Aaliyah could feel his eyes on her. She recognized the position of his hand, still resting lightly on the gun at her side, as if she were a real threat. The air was heavy and tense. Aaliyah knew this was no ordinary traffic stop. This was a check aimed at her race, at the color of her skin. She took a deep breath, knowing that this might not end that simply. Reynolds held Aaliyah's license in his hand, his eyes scanning it suspiciously. He was silent for a few seconds, as if waiting for something, perhaps a sign that she was hiding something, or simply to extend his power in the situation. "What do you do?" he asked, his tone laced with contempt. Aaliyah met his eyes and kept her voice steady. "Am I obligated to answer that question, officer?" Reynolds just sneered. Miller, who had been standing behind her, suddenly burst out laughing rudely. "Perhaps your profession is someone's concubine." Aaliyah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her face expressionless. "I have a right to know exactly why I was pulled over," she said, her voice low but authoritative. Reynolds snorted, curling the corners of his mouth into a smirk. "Reason? I just said, your taillight is broken." Aaliyah crossed her arms over her chest. "I know my car is fine. I have a dash cam. I can check it right now." Miller sneered, shaking her head as if she had just said something stupid. The atmosphere changed, from a routine examination to an implicit clash of power. Reynolds was growing impatient. He moved closer, his breath carrying a strong smell, not exactly alcohol, but something spicy. "Stop pretending," he said, his voice hard. "A black person like you driving like this? Where does he get the money?" Aaliyah stared at him, her eyes dark, but said nothing. Miller added, his voice full of sarcasm, "I bet it was drugs, or maybe some kind of scam." Rage surged through Aaliyah's chest like a tidal wave. She had seen situations like this in her files, had heard hundreds of stories of police officers abusing their power to dehumanize black people. But this was not a story in her files. This was happening to her. She took a deep breath, keeping her tone firm but controlled. "I have no obligation to answer these insulting questions. If you don't have a valid reason, I will leave." She reached out to take the papers back from Reynolds, but he didn't return them. His eyes suddenly darkened, as if she had just sparked something he had been waiting for. Aaliyah felt the need to protect herself. She pulled her phone out of her coat pocket, turned on the camera, and held it up to start recording. But in a split second, Reynolds snatched her phone away and threw it onto the street. "We don't like people filming here," he said, his voice harsh, his eyes cold and menacing. "Are you resisting law enforcement?" Aaliyah's eyes widened, her hands clenching. "That's my phone." "You have no right to—" But before she could finish her sentence, Reynolds roughly opened the car door and grabbed her arm. "Who gave you that attitude towards the police?" Aaliyah struggled free, but before she could react, Miller lunged from behind, one hand grabbing her wrist, the other twisting her arm behind her back. "Watch out! You just broke the law!" Reynolds sneered, his hand quickly pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "What the hell are you guys doing?" Aaliyah screamed, anger exploding as she felt the cold cuffs tighten around her wrists. "You are under arrest for resisting an officer," Reynolds announced, his voice full of glee. "This is abuse of power. I will sue you," Aaliyah protested, her whole body tense with anger. But the two policemen didn't care. They dragged her toward the patrol car, ignoring her screams and protests in the quiet of the night. Inside the patrol car, the space was cramped and stuffy. The handcuffs tightened around Aaliyah's wrists, as cold and unforgiving as the men behind the wheel. Reynolds and Miller continued their prank. "Look at the way she's quiet," Miller smirked, glancing in the rearview mirror at Aaliyah. Probably thinking of some sob story to tell the press. Reynolds laughed, one hand patting the steering wheel, satisfied. "The press? By tomorrow morning, she'll just be a black girl arrested for resisting arrest. Who cares?" Aaliyah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms until they hurt. She wasn't afraid, but anger burned inside her like a fire. She knew the system too well, knew that with just one wrong step, things could go horribly wrong. But she also knew she was not a normal person to be trampled like this without consequences. Aaliyah was pushed forcefully into the police station, her legs wobbly, but she kept her back straight. The detention room was cold, the strong smell of bleach mixed with sweat and rusty metal. The contemptuous gazes of the other officers were fixed on her, as if she were just another criminal. One of the officers standing nearby snorted, looking her up and down with disdain. "Looks like one of those troublemakers from the slums, huh?" he sneered. Several other officers burst out laughing in response. Aaliyah didn't react. She was used to this kind of discrimination. But inside, anger was rising. Reynolds leaned against the bars, tapping them slowly, as if savoring the moment. "You think you're special?" he chuckled. "Here, people like you are just trash." Miller stood beside her, arms crossed, an amused look on his face. "You stay there, princess. We'll have a beautiful report for you tomorrow morning." Aaliyah remained silent, but her eyes said it all. No fear, no panic. There was only a silent indignation and an unspoken warning. Reynolds felt suddenly uncomfortable under her gaze. He gritted his teeth and banged his fist on the bars. "What are you looking at?" he growled. "I'm talking to you." Aaliyah slowly smiled, and that's when things started to change. Aaliyah straightened up, her eyes shining. "I have the right to make phone calls." Her voice was calm, but carried the sharpness of someone who could not be shaken. Reynolds sneered. "Who do you think you are? A criminal demanding a lawyer?" Aaliyah looked straight at him. This was the moment she needed to strike. "I don't need a lawyer," she said slowly, clearly. "I'm a federal prosecutor." At that moment, an eerie silence fell over the room. Another officer standing nearby suddenly stopped, his eyes blinking as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "What?" he muttered, eyes wide. Reynolds frowned. He looked at Miller, then back at Aaliyah, as if trying to confirm whether she was telling the truth. One of the officers hurried over, pulled out his phone, and quickly looked up her information on the system. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became suffocatingly tense. Seconds later, the officer's face turned pale. "She," he stuttered, sweat running down his forehead. He turned to Reynolds, eyes wide with horror. "She's a federal prosecutor, and she knows the sheriff." The whole police station was dead silent. Reynolds and Miller froze in place. No one said anything for what seemed like centuries. Then everything went haywire. An officer rushed out of the room, nearly tripping as he tried to call Police Chief Michael Harrington. "Hurry! We have a big problem!" he gasped over the phone. Just a few minutes later, a black car stopped in front of the police station. The car door opened. Michael Harrington enters. When his tall figure appeared, all the officers in the room stood up straight and fell silent. Reynolds and Miller turned pale. Because they knew. They had made a terrible mistake. The atmosphere in the police station became stifling. All eyes turned to Michael Harrington, the city's police chief. He didn't hurry, but his steps were strong and authoritative. His face was hard, his jaw clenched, his sharp eyes scanning the room, where Aaliyah Carter was still handcuffed behind bars. A cold fury filled the air. Harrington saw Aaliyah in handcuffs, and it drove him crazy. "Release her immediately!" His voice echoed throughout the station, causing all the officers to startle. Reynolds and Miller stood frozen. They stuttered, their faces pale as if there was no blood left in their bodies. We don't know who she is," Reynolds said, his voice soft and devoid of any of its previous arrogance. His biggest mistake wasn't not knowing who Aaliyah was. His mistake was thinking she didn't deserve respect. Harrington took a step forward, his eyes filled with anger. "You don't need to know who she is to treat her like a human being." The whole room was silent. No one dared to say a word. Reynolds and Miller bowed their heads, not daring to look him in the eye. Harrington held out his hand. "Give me the videotape from the patrol car camera." An officer rushed to get the data. No one dared to delay. Aaliyah remained silent, but her eyes were unwavering. She wanted to see them pay. A few minutes later, the monitor in the surveillance room lit up. The dash cam from the patrol car began playing video. The image appears clearly. Reynolds banged on Aaliyah's car window. "A black person like you drives like this? Where does that money come from?" Miller laughed. "Drugs, I bet. Or maybe some kind of scam." Aaliyah's phone was snatched, and she was roughly dragged out of the car. "We don't like people filming here. Are you resisting law enforcement?" The whole police station was silent. The eyes of the surrounding officers showed shock. There is no denying it. Everything is clearly recorded. Harrington clenched his fists, his knuckles white with anger. He turned to Reynolds and Miller, his eyes burning with anger. Reynolds turned pale, his breathing becoming rapid. He knew he was dead. I didn't mean," he stuttered, trying to come up with an excuse. But Aaliyah didn't let him finish. Her voice cut across, cold as a sharp knife. "It doesn't matter whether you meant it or not. The fact is, you did it." Miller swallowed, his forehead covered in sweat. No more arrogant smiles, no more disdainful attitudes. There was only fear. Harrington didn't need to hear any more excuses. He turned to the other officers and gave a firm order. "Suspend Reynolds and Miller immediately." No one dared to object. The two officers turned pale and their lips trembled. We can explain," Miller stuttered, his voice nearly breaking. Harrington glared at him, silencing him immediately. Then he turned to Aaliyah. She stood there, her back straight, her eyes sharp as knives, but there was a hint of satisfaction in them. "I will sue this entire police department if necessary," she declared. Reynolds and Miller froze. They realized that their careers could end right here. After being suspended immediately, Jake Reynolds and Scott Miller were asked to stay on pending an internal investigation. The officers in the station avoided them. No one wanted to get involved with two people who were in trouble. No more arrogance, no more contemptuous smiles. Now both were left with only fear. Reynolds and Miller were summoned into an interrogation room, where two inspectors from the Internal Affairs Department were waiting. "Do you know what you have done?" one of the inspectors asked, his eyes cold. Reynolds swallowed but said nothing. He knew he had no way back. Clear, undeniable evidence. Video from a patrol car camera captured their every racist rant. Witnesses were other officers who saw Aaliyah being brought into the station in an unjustified, handcuffed state. Reynolds and Miller's personal histories have also come under scrutiny. It turns out this isn't their first time engaging in racist and abusive behavior. The investigation lasted several weeks, but the final conclusion was inevitable. Reynolds and Miller were charged with false imprisonment, abuse of power, and racial profiling. The trial took place in front of hundreds of people, many of whom held banners protesting police violence. The prosecutor presented clear evidence, allowing no excuses. Reynolds and Miller were sentenced to 3 years in prison, along with a lifetime ban from police service. When the verdict was announced, both of them bowed their heads, not daring to look up. Their careers are officially over. News of the incident spread widely. The media reported everywhere. Major news agencies focused on this scandal. A series of protests broke out across the city. People held up banners. Justice for all, regardless of skin color. Reform the police force immediately. No one is above the law, not even the police. The city government is under intense pressure to conduct a comprehensive audit of racist practices in the police force. Several other police officers were also investigated, and some were fired, for conduct similar to Reynolds and Miller. Eventually, the police department was forced to introduce a series of new reforms. Tighten internal discipline. Implement stricter supervision procedures for patrol officers. Strengthen anti-racism training. The Aaliyah Carter case became one of the biggest impetus for this reform. After the trial, Aaliyah Carter appeared before the press, standing in front of hundreds of cameras. She is no longer a victim. She is a fighter for justice. Her voice was strong and decisive, her eyes determined. Today, I was arrested because of the color of my skin, but I won't let this happen to anyone else. Each word echoed throughout the auditorium, causing everyone to fall silent and listen. She was not speaking just for herself. She speaks for thousands of people who have suffered injustice like her. I pledge to continue fighting for justice and against abuse of power. The crowd erupted in applause, protesters chanting her name, hailing her as a symbol of change. From this moment on, Aaliyah Carter was more than just a federal prosecutor. She became one of the most important voices in the fight against injustice. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.